Hi guys. Before we proceed to this video, we've got something very important to share with you. Neoliberalism, Inequality and Authoritarianism by Professor John V. Kofis is available for purchase. You can order it directly from the publisher Little French eBooks or through Amazon.
Hello everyone, welcome. This is an analytical session on the assassination of a right-wing commentator and radio show host Charlie Kirk on the 10th of September 2025. The assassination obviously is a tragedy for the family, and it should be viewed as exactly that universally. However, its symbolism is far-reaching in American society and across the world, considering that this comes amid a period that the United States is experiencing a heightened cold civil war. In other words, a period when there is extreme political, social, economic polarization in American society to the degree that people, as Senator Bernie Sanders pointed out in his own video on the Charlie Cook assassination, refuse to resolve differences about what kind of America they want for themselves and for their children, and instead they resort to violence. Political assassinations are not new, from Abraham Lincoln to President Kennedy, Martin Luther King, Bobby Kennedy, and of course assassination attempts on Ronald Reagan, on Donald Trump. So we have a society where there is a culture of political violence, and it is deeply rooted in its institutions. And I will certainly look at this issue very briefly, because the Charlie Cook story is not to be viewed in isolation from a monolithic perspective, but rather all the branches of the story are to be analyzed to be fair about what happened and what it means for American society in 2025 and of course beyond, and how this fits into the history of American political violence. Now, let me point out that this this young man, came from a middle-class background, immersed himself in the aftermath of the Great Recession, which produced more polarization in American society, including the Tea Party movement. This young man, Charlie Cook, immersed himself in the Tea Party movement, and this is where his roots, ideological roots, rest. However, I must point out that, as a couple of articles that I've read in the last 2 days, obviously this is a very recent event, in some of his talks, commentators have pointed out, really it's like listening or reading material from neoliberal ideologues. In other words, reading material that you would find in the Wall Street Journal pages about the virtues of the neoliberal economy. And in fact, the right-wing rhetoric, the harsh right-wing rhetoric, the populism of that rhetoric, and the delivery, which was flamboyant, and the rhetoric rather polemic, that kind of rhetoric really was masking policies that are in essence neoliberal. This is what Charlie Kirk, was promoting. And commentators who just recently wrote, or just a couple of that I read, wrote this, are absolutely correct. So he was no different. He came out of a tradition of the Tea Party movement, which was masking, funded by billionaires, by the way, let me point out, people who believe and have an interest because they make money from this political economy in the neoliberal system. What is neoliberalism? Very briefly, starts in the late 70s under Carter. He sets the historical antecedents to it, institutionalized by Ronald Reagan, continues during the George Herbert Walker Bush presidency, the one-term presidency, intensifies under Bill Clinton and on to this day under Trump. Because the neoliberal system has meant massive transfer of wealth from the working class and the middle class, massive transfer of wealth directly and indirectly. When you look at just two bills, one in 2017, the other just in 2025, this year, both during the Trump presidency, we had a transfer of about roughly $6.5 trillion from the bottom to the top to the richest 5%, and within that, the richest 1%, the so-called oligarchy, as Senator Sanders, as well as other senators and congresspeople on the progressive side call it. So we have seen the erosion of the social welfare state and the massive accumulation of wealth for the richest 1% of America. This is a very difficult proposition to sustain. You can't explain this to the American people. You have to somehow try to justify it. If you're a politician, if you're the media, if you're a spokesperson for Wall Street, you have to somehow divert the attention of the people away from what is really going on, and that is taking the state being used as a vehicle to take money out of their pockets and give it to billionaires and millionaires, some of whom are honest enough, like Warren Buffett, to point out we don't need this. It should go back into the economy through the pockets of the working class and the middle class, and we'll make the profits, stimulate the economy that way. There are many ways to achieve capital formation. This is not the only one. So anyway, this type of right-wing rhetoric that this young man was engaged in, and by the way, this is an individual who comes along in the long history of American right-wing radio talk show hosts. This is not the first one. There are many, many of them spread throughout America for decades, going back to the Reagan period. So this is someone who follows along those lines. And although it may seem, because the media, both the conservative and the liberal media, present the case, and this is still a fresh case, and I'll talk about some of the particulars, what the FBI is doing, by the way. But when you, on the surface, it seems, oh, this was just a crusader for the far right, a Christian nationalist crusader out there doing the job for the voting base of the conservatives, the Trump base, basically. Actually, when you scratch the surface, you find something else. What you find is that this was behind Charlie Kirk was a highly organized operation in the millions of dollars. And it involved very wealthy people behind this young man. So this is not to castigate any kind of skepticism on the tragedy. And indeed, everyone should look at it as that and condemn it, by the way, instead of some individuals on the center who argue, well, he was just a right winger. That doesn't mean that this person deserved to go in this manner. This is not what an open society, a democracy, a civil society does. This is not how things are handled. You don't, when a society finds itself at the point where political differences are resolved through political assassination, that means that society has lapsed to either, as some scholars in the past have called, either third worldism, and I have used that term myself in writings and in videos. In other words, it's become a country like the global south where there's a dictatorship, or the country has become a right out authoritarian, and political violence seems to be the way to resolve differences. That's not what, of course, the Constitution of the United States is. This is a liberal democracy founded on 18th century Enlightenment principles. This is highly uncivilized. However, the reality is that there was a highly organized enterprise behind this individual. This individual, so I'll just give you some statistics. According to published reports that I have looked at, this was an $84 million operation. 18 million of those were assets of the operation. The operation was founded by this young man and a few others, and it is called American Comeback, like Make America Great Again. And it has its roots in the Tea Party movement, that is far right-wing roots of neoliberalism, nationalism, militarism, and aspects of authoritarianism. The profits for the group, the income, the net income was 4 million. So we're not talking about some crusader, some what is that called? Robin Hood type of person. This is a multi-million-dollar operation. This is a lot of money exchanging hands. Now, where did that money come from? Charlie Cook was introduced to a man during the Tea Party movement from Wyoming, I believe. His name is Foster Friess. This was a very wealthy individual, a businessman. He ran for governor in 2018. He was favorably impressed by Charlie Kirk. He provided the financing to help this young man be in the forefront of propagating for neoliberalism, propagating an ideology that is based on the principles of the Tea Party movement, nationalism against identity politics, against the social welfare state, against spending more money for health and human services, for the environment, to help the marginalized population of America, minorities, against identity politics. So we're talking about a movement that is solidly, that evolves solidly behind what Trump mobilized in 2016, and it then evolved into the MAGA movement, the Make America Great Again movement, and that's what this was. Now, where did Charlie Kirk and these people want to take America? Back to the 19th century, back before the Civil Rights Movement, back when there was segregation, back to when the Anglo-Saxon elites were the dominant elites. Obviously fear that in 20, 30 years, the white majority in America is going to become the minority, given that 1/3 of the population of America right now is Black and Hispanic. First Hispanic, by the way, they're the largest minority, and then Black. And so part of it is that part of it is that there is so much frustration on the part of the masses, the working class and the middle class pushed down toward the working class, that people want answers. They want real answers. They don't want rhetoric, vacuous rhetoric about what populism, in other words, what enemy to hate, the type of rhetoric that we see in interwar totalitarian societies. Hate that person over there, hate that group over there, and that's going to solve your problems. Well, the American people do demand answers for structural impediments to their progress and to declining living standards. This kind of propaganda, this kind of the politics of distortion and distraction was designed to camouflage what was really happening, has been happening in American society, undergoing this transition to a to creating a chasm, a huge gap between the few rich at the very top, let's say 5%. I won't say 1%. Let's say 5%. And the bottom 78%, according to government statistics, living from paycheck to paycheck. This is a very serious matter. And the question is, what happens to that bottom 78% after the next recession or deep recession or even a depression takes place? So these people were using the politics of division to distract the American society to cultural wars, the cultural fear, to camouflage the neoliberal agenda, which only serves Wall Street interests. Now, Kirk was gunned down on September 10th. By the way, just for the record, officially the FBI has published pictures of someone who he could be the assassin. Maybe he's not. I don't know. I have no idea. They have not concluded anything. The local police in Utah were not. They gave an interview to BBC World News, and they said, well, they thought they had someone, then they were wrong. However, this is what I noticed, and I'm not going to blame anybody for my own conclusions. But the young man was wearing, the assassin, allegedly, if this is in fact a true picture that the FBI has, he was wearing a T-shirt with the American flag and an eagle in the middle of the flag. Now, what are the chances that this is someone from the progressive left? As many have argued, oh, this is someone on the left who killed Charlie Kirk. Maybe the person did it on purpose to distract the authorities that, here I am wearing the American flag with an eagle and claws, to distract them that he's a right winger. But usually this is not the kind of clothing that progressive individuals wear. Be that as it may, there is no official word on who actually carried out this. Now, Kirk, for his part, did carry out an agenda of spreading the gospel according to the Tea Party / MAGA movements, because the MAGA movement is a continuation of the Tea Party movement of the early 2010s, by the way. It's the same popular base that has been incorporated into the Republican Party. The agenda is to basically identify anyone who's a liberal or an establishment Democrat, who actually some of the establishment Democrats, many of the establishment Democrats, I shouldn't say some, many of the establishment Democrats, as we have seen in the last 4 years with Joe Biden, are hardcore Cold War militarists. They believe in military solutions to diplomatic crisis, not in resolving them through diplomacy. And they also are not interested in compromising the neoliberal agenda in the interests of Wall Street corporations and the billionaires. They too have embraced the class warfare that the rich, as Warren Buffett pointed out, have declared on the working class. Now, Charlie Cook, simply, he didn't invent the wheel. Believe me, I have listened to his speeches. Very heated rhetoric, very extreme rhetoric, and the theatrics were interesting as well. However, the subject matter, and the substance of what he says has been around for decades. There's nothing new there. Identifying, for example, anyone who is a centrist, a Democrat, as a leftist. Now, leftist, by the way, has a specific meaning. It goes back to the French Revolution. When that erupted in 1789, the more radical elements of the French Revolutionary Assembly were sitting on the left side of the assembly, or in the room, in the auditorium. and the more moderate in the center, and the more conservatives on the right side. And that's where the origin of that comes. And of course, left is just a nebulous term. It includes everybody from a social democrat to a Trotskyist Marxist. So now these people, of course, lump everyone together, and this is that is not an invention of these right-wing radio talk show hosts either. When you look at the Cold War, throughout the Cold War, the mainstream media, politicians, American intellectuals lumped everyone into the category of left and communist, whether they were in the non-aligned movement or actually in communist China or the Soviet Union, and they just lumped them together. So they're in other words, the monolithic enemy, communism. When in fact, as Henry Kissinger, hardly a Marxist, by the way, realized, these people are they're very different. Obviously, he realized that there's a big difference between what the Chinese communists were, Chinese communists and Soviet, and he took advantage of that. That's why there was the visit to China by Kissinger, then Nixon, of course, and the amelioration of relations between the U.S. and China during the Nixon presidency. Everybody, I mean, people who have studied this know this. However, the rhetoric in the mass media today is to call someone who is, for example, a social democrat, let's say Senator Sanders, to call him a leftist, when in fact he is a Keynesian or a New Deal Democrat from the FDR era. That's all he is. Mamdani, who's running for mayor in New York, same thing as Sanders. So these people, to further polarizing society, use loaded terms like leftist in polemical rhetoric to divide. So there's no difference between, for example, Chuck Schumer, Senator Sanders, and Angela Davis. They're all the same. This is part of the strategy to reduce them to the same level and demonize them, so that can have a broad popular appeal, so they can broaden their mass base. And they did, by the way. The fact is that the Charlie Kirk was influential in America. This is how we can explain the massive amount of money, millions of dollars pouring into the movement. The organization, he created, American Comeback, he created. And there were, by the way, I should point out, it's not just millionaire money. There were people who sent in money as well. They sent in donations and so forth. The tragedy about the young man, in my view, as a personal issue, is for him and his family, is that he was a gun rights advocate and believed that in America, citizens should be armed. And unfortunately, he was gunned down. This is indeed a tragedy. The gun culture of America is indeed itself a tragedy. And there are many analysts, articles, and books have been written about the gun culture of America, that it is at the root of the problem. And Congresswoman Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez from New York came out to comment about Charlie Kirk and the assassination. She immediately said, oh, well, it's the guns, it's the gun lobby and the guns. Part of the problem is that, but that's not the problem. That's not the root. That's not the whole issue, because there are countries where they have higher ownership per capita of guns. I believe Switzerland is one, than the United States, but they have very low crime rate because they don't have a culture of violence. Okay. So, and they don't have the socioeconomic and polarization, which is then reflected in political polarization and results in political assassinations, such as this unfortunate event. So we have to really get away from the superficialities of superficial solutions. Fine, the gun issue is, the gun lobby is very influential, and gun ownership is important, and so forth. But that is not by itself a root cause of why there is a cold civil war in the United States, or why this young man was gunned down, unfortunately, in the manner that he was, speaking out his mind. Yes, obviously, I disagree with everything that he was saying, but that doesn't mean that violence has to be used to eliminate. The use of violence historically, by the way, let me just point this out. According to FBI files, the use of violence, political violence, when we take out the mentally ill, because Cesare Beccaria, who wrote the definitive book during the era of the Enlightenment on crime and punishment, the definitive book that influenced the modern criminal justice system in the Western countries, pointed out you basically have people who are mentally ill committing crimes, people who have a motive to accumulate wealth, and of course, people who are starving, like Jean Valjean in Victor Hugo's novel, Les Miserables, to basically go out and steal a loaf of bread so they can survive. Without violence, that was a non-violent crime, by the way, just stealing a loaf of bread. But the basic issue here is that throughout American history, when you look at from Abraham Lincoln to the present, in general, this is not everyone, obviously, but most of the political violent crimes have been committed, and political assassinations especially, by right-wingers, okay? The lynchings of blacks. Who did that? Liberals? Leftists? So we have a long-standing history in the country of this reality. And this reality has been well documented. There are a lot of books on this topic, by the way, in criminal justice material, scholarly works, articles and books on this. So there is no doubt about it. Now, the tragedy, in my view, even worse than this long trend and this young man coming, falling victim to this trend, is that the government in the United States has actually been using this issue to make some political hate, to advance its political agenda of right-wing populism. Now, when it is, in my view, deeply disturbing that when former president, President Jimmy Carter passed away, there was no order from the White House to have the flags, lower the flags in national buildings. However, there was for Charlie Kirk. This is really sending a signal to America that the President of the United States, who is President for all people, President of the United States is not the President of the right-wing constituency. It's the President for all Americans, whether they're blacks, whether they're workers, mining workers in West Virginia, or steel workers in Pennsylvania, or potato farmers in Idaho. It doesn't matter. They're workers. The president represents all people, not a small right-wing constituency. Okay, because when you add the numbers, the fact is, and when you look at the approval ratings of President Trump, look at the latest polls, this is not a good signal to have the flags lowered for this individual. This is not to argue that there should not be the utmost respect for this tragedy. There should be. But to do this for an individual whom they're exploiting. They're exploiting the tragic death, by the way, and not to do it for President Carter. That speaks volume of the cold civil war in America, by the way, and that's what I want to get across here. It also speaks volume that the Vice President of the United States, J.D. Vance, used Air Force Two, which is the Vice President's plane, to have the casket transferred from up there in Utah to bring it down to Arizona, where his wife is from, I suppose. I think she's from Arizona, and to accompany the family down in Arizona with full honors and so forth. And this again shows the open link. Again, this is not to disrespect by any means the family and its tragedy, but is this the kind of what kind of a political message does this send? Would they do this, for example, knock on wood, when Angela Davis passes away? Obviously not. Would they do it when Bernie Sanders passes away? No. Or Alexandria Cortez. Again, knock on wood on any of these people. They would not. So the question is, why is this sort of partisanship? The only explanation is to exacerbate the cold civil war, to further polarize society, consolidate the base, because they're pushing an agenda of militarism abroad and social injustice at home. And this tragedy, like I said, this tragedy falls into their lap, and they're using it for that. I want to point out that the United States is a society that unfortunately has a very bad record of political violence and violence in general. In fact, the United States has a long-standing history of violence, in part because the Northwest Europeans who colonized it used violence to take over the land of Native Americans, named the Indians, and then used violence because they engaged in the transatlantic slave trade and used a slave labor force in the southern states. So slavery was legal. It was legal until the Civil War, and then the apartheid conditions that existed until the Civil Rights Acts of 64, 65. So you have basically an institutional and cultural violence in society because of the socioeconomic structure and because of the politics of exclusivity, not to mention, by the way, that the Northwest Europeans, namely the Anglo-Saxon majority, were the dominant elites. And not until John Kennedy do you even have a Catholic in the White House. So you have a long-standing history. This is not surprising that we have here in Charlie Cook an individual who represents 19th century ideological conditions, thinking of ideological conditions, considering that the President of the United States on January 20th, during his inauguration, argued that he wants to make America great again by taking it back to the Gilded Age of the 1880s and 1890s. This was the age called the age of cartels and the age when there was segregation, the age of Jim Crow laws. This was not the age when the Ku Klux Klan operated freely. This is not an age to be proud of, an age against women and trade unionists. Okay. So the fact is that we have to look at this particular event in its historical context. And what we see when we put it in historical context is that, oh yeah, it fits in, it makes sense. The question is, of course, where is this going? And why have we come to this point, to a cold civil war that is getting worse to the degree that whether the assassin was mentally ill, a fanatic, left or liberal or right wing, I don't know who the shooter was, but regardless, it doesn't matter. whether this sort of situation will become worse. Now, when the state uses force as liberally as the state has used force in the last 8 months since Trump took over in Los Angeles, especially going after illegal immigrants, who, by the way, are workers. Illegal immigrants are workers. They work in farms, they work in hotels, cleaning rooms, they work in restaurants. Everybody who's been to America, lived in America, knows that, right? They work in the onion fields, they pick lettuce, they do construction, right? They do odd jobs for cash. They're workers. This was a war on workers. And using force to send them back to the degree that they did, going to the extent of chilling relations with South Korea, a major ally of the United States, geopolitically very important to the United States because China is next door, alienating them because they attacked one of their factories, a Hyundai auto factory down the south, I believe it was in Alabama, and arresting a few hundred of their workers, who, by the way, were illegal. But the fact is that the factory had an agreement to bring those people as technical personnel to support the auto factory. And back in South Korea, of course, in very vicious criticism, when you look at the South Korean press against the United States doing this, because they don't want to be treated the way they figure, okay, you can treat the Mexicans and the Guatemalans like this, but not us. So this is the politics. The state promotes this stuff. It promotes this kind of violent solution to issues that could be settled through legal means without the use of the National Guard and ICE and Homeland Security. Use lawyers, don't use soldiers. That's the issue. And this resonates with the American people. The fact that they look at it, and a lot of people, 350 million people, they're all sorts of people. Obviously, a number of them have mental problems, have psychological problems, and they're going to resort to force. They look, oh yes. They believe that if they gun down somewhere, that somehow gives them godlike powers, or they believe that's going to solve problems in society, which doesn't solve anything, creates more problems. So unfortunately, what we have here is the state, especially, this is not to blame Trump, by the way, because this transcends political parties and politics. However, the last 8 months have not been easy. And threatening to send troops to Chicago, to New York, to Boston, to Baltimore. You see, this is, the American people are looking at this and, okay, what kind of a society is this? It solves its problems through force, through the National Guard, through the defense, through the armed forces and the police. Now, the United States, by the way, just for the record, has 1.8 million incarcerated. It's the highest, in other words, prisoners, the highest number of prisoners in the world. It's 350 million. China is 1.5 billion, and it ranks second in the world in terms of incarceration. The US ranks first with 350 million, China with 1.5 billion second. And yet China is the authoritarian country, which, by the way, this is not to excuse China. It is one-party state. It is hardly Norway, let's face it. However, these are the statistics. And when you look at the incarceration statistics, and then when you break down the demographics of who is incarcerated, then you have a bad picture, because it's minorities mostly and working class people, not those engaged in money laundering and interest rate fixing and manipulating stock prices and so on. It's not those people, or taking bribes under the table, not those people. White collar crime, very few. Low level crime, street crime, neighborhood crime, family feuds and so forth crime, yes. So the criminal justice system betrays what's going on in the country. that it is a country where it empowers the police to go after the working class and marginalized population. I'm not surprised at all, by the way. I feel very badly that this young man was taken at the prime of his life, leaving a family behind. However, I'm not surprised that it happened, and I regret to say that it will happen again, because a society that has institutional and cultural, political violence in its blood, if you will, in its veins, running through its veins, where else is it going to go? It's going to go this route, and that is very regrettable. When the state promotes xenophobia, it promotes underlying racism, class warfare. This is not, it's not surprising this happened at all. I believe that the record will show that the motives for the Kirk, I have no clue who, obviously, any more than anybody else. That I believe that what we'll see is that Kirk will be made a sort of a martyr. A number of analysts have already addressed this issue. The GOP will make a martyr, and they have already laid the foundations for making a martyr, which is unfortunate, by the way. And the reason it's unfortunate is because it simply adds to the cold Civil War climate of America. What is achieved by this? What is achieved? Society should be healing, should be coming together, not being driven further apart by making him, he died, have a respectable funeral, and move on, and try to heal and make sure, adopt policies that address social justice and peace, decrease the causes, the structural causes that create division, by having a society where living standards for 78% of the people have been chronically going down, by the way, from Reagan to the present, to the degree where that percentage lives from paycheck to paycheck, while the top 1% owns more wealth than 90% of the population. This is not a good picture for a society that calls itself, by the way, the greatest democracy in the world. That's right, the greatest democracy in the world. This is not a good picture at all. The frightening thing is, in my view, as the GOP will make a martyr out of Charlie Kirk, is that the fight for America, whether it is going to be based on social justice and democracy versus authoritarianism in a police state, will explode in the future. I fear that after the race in New York shows Mamdani to be the winner, that things will get even worse. So one hopes for the best, and one hopes that rational people, rooted in the ideals of the 18th century Enlightenment, where the founding fathers were, prevail, and that they come together and address structural problems to mitigate polarization that prevails in America. Thank you very much for listening. Please write comments, ask questions, and join this channel. Thank you very much.